Kevin says it's just routine, honey. He needs your signature too, since you're both trustees. My mother said that to me, sliding a manila folder across her kitchen table, and I want to tell you that I almost signed it right there, standing in her kitchen on a Thursday afternoon with nothing more than a pen and my mother's trusting face in front of me. I didn't. I read it twice instead. And what I found on the second read is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. I remember the specific ordinariness of that Thursday afternoon before everything changed. The same kitchen I'd eaten breakfast in as a boy, the same faded yellow curtains, my mother's coffee pot gurgling through its final cycle on the counter behind her. I'd stopped by after work, the way I did most Thursdays, expecting nothing more eventful than our usual hour of conversation before I headed home for the evening. I remember setting my keys down on the same spot on that kitchen table I'd been setting them down on for years, a small, unconscious habit that made the folder sliding toward me across that same surface feel, for a moment, like just one more unremarkable piece of the routine. My name is Gregory Palmer. I'm 61 years old. I work as a certified public accountant here in Sacramento, and my mother, Alina, is 85, living independently in the same house I grew up in, managing reasonably well on her own with some help from a part-time caregiver 3 days a week, though her memory has been slipping gradually enough over the past 2 years that all three of us, my mother, my brother Kevin, and I, have understood, without ever needing to say it too directly, that some of her financial decisions increasingly require a second set of careful eyes. I want to describe what that gradual decline has actually looked like, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how vulnerable my mother had become to a request framed the specific way Kevin's was. It started small, the way these things usually do, forgetting whether she'd already paid a particular bill, a specific confusion about which day of the week it was that would clear up within an hour or two, small lapses that our family doctor, at her annual checkup 2 years ago, described as consistent with mild cognitive impairment, not yet dementia in any clinically diagnosable sense, but a genuine, gradual softening of the sharp, precise memory that had defined her. First as a bookkeeper for a downtown law firm, and later, after retiring, as the meticulous manager of our family's household finances for over 4 decades. I remember a specific afternoon, maybe 18 months ago, when I stopped by unannounced and found her standing in her own kitchen, genuinely uncertain whether she'd already eaten lunch that day. A small, ordinary moment that nonetheless landed with a specific weight, watching a woman who had once balanced our family's entire household budget down to the penny, every month for decades, now uncertain about something as basic as whether she'd had lunch. I didn't make a large production of it that afternoon, simply making her a sandwich and sitting with her while she ate it. But I remember driving home afterward with a specific, quiet grief, understanding that the mother I'd known my entire life was gradually, irreversibly becoming someone slightly different, someone who needed considerably more looking after than she had even 2 years earlier. The caregiver we hired, a warm, patient woman named Carla Jimenez who comes 3 afternoons a week, has been an enormous help managing the practical realities of that decline. But I want to be honest that her presence hadn't fully registered for either Kevin or me. Exactly how much more vulnerable our mother had become to precisely the kind of confident, urgent request Kevin's paperwork represented. A specific gap in our own understanding that this entire situation forced both of us to finally confront directly. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. That second set of eyes was supposed to be exactly what my father, Walter Palmer, built into his estate plan before he died 6 years ago, naming both Kevin and me as co-trustees of a family trust that holds my mother's house and the bulk of her remaining savings. A specific structural safeguard my father put in place precisely because he understood, even then, that a single trustee managing an aging parent's assets alone carries risks that two trustees, checking each, are considerably better positioned to catch. I remember the specific conversation my father had with both Kevin and me, maybe a year before he died, sitting us both down at that same kitchen table to explain exactly why he'd structured the trust with dual trustees rather than naming just one of us, or naming a third-party professional trustee entirely. He told us, with the specific plain-spoken directness that had defined most of his important conversations with us over the years, that he trusted both of us individually, but that he'd watched, over his own long career running a small manufacturing business, more than one family torn apart by a single trusted child, managing an aging parent's finances alone, sometimes through outright dishonesty, but more often, he said, through nothing more sinister than well-intentioned decisions that simply went unchecked by anyone positioned to catch a mistake before it became serious. He wanted us checking each other's work, he said, not out of distrust, but out of exactly the kind of care that requires a second opinion on decisions that matter enough to warrant one. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Now let's get back to it. I want to tell you about Kevin before I tell you about that folder, because I think the specific shape of our relationship matters for understanding how genuinely blindsided I was by what I eventually found inside it. Kevin is 55, 3 years younger than me, and has run Palmer Auto Group, a used car dealership our father helped him start 22 years ago, for his entire adult working life. Kevin and I have never been especially close, not out of any specific conflict, but simply the ordinary drift that happens between brothers who chose different paths. Me toward a steady, conservative accounting career. Kevin toward the specific, volatile rhythm of running his own business. Good years and difficult years cycling through in a pattern I understood only from a comfortable, professional distance. The way you understand a sibling's life through holiday conversations, rather than genuine daily involvement. I remember specifically our father's pride when Kevin first opened Palmer Auto Group at 33, a specific, considerable investment our father made, both financially and in the countless weekends he spent helping Kevin renovate the original lot. And I remember my own quiet, complicated relationship to that pride, having chosen myself the considerably less dramatic path of a stable accounting career that never once generated the same kind of visible, tangible excitement that watching your son build a business from an empty gravel lot apparently produces in a father. I don't say that with any real resentment, looking back. I think I understood, even then, that Kevin and I were simply built for different kinds of risk tolerance, and that our father loved both versions of what his sons had become, even if one of those versions made for more colorful dinner table conversation than the other. I remember the specific afternoon Palmer Auto Group's original lot opened, our father standing near the entrance in a suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion, greeting the first handful of customers with a pride he rarely displayed so openly. And I remember thinking, watching him that day, that I had never once seen him quite that visibly moved by anything I'd accomplished in my own considerably quieter career. A small, private comparison I never voiced to anyone, but in some low-grade way, for years afterward, a specific undercurrent I only fully understood, watching Kevin's own struggles decades later, as an entirely ordinary thing for siblings to feel about each other's different paths. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Our relationship over the following 2 decades settled into a specific, comfortable pattern of holidays and occasional family gatherings, warm enough but never especially deep. The kind of sibling relationship that functions perfectly well without either party ever quite knowing the granular details of the other's daily life or genuine struggles. I knew Kevin had good years and bad years running the dealership, the ordinary ebb and flow of a small business owner's life. But I had no specific window into the actual severity of what he was navigating at any given moment, because neither of us had ever built the habit of that kind of financial transparency with each other, even after our father's death left us jointly responsible for our mother's care. I had no specific reason, walking into my mother's kitchen that Thursday afternoon, to suspect Kevin of anything. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for understanding how carefully I actually had to work to overcome my own instinct to simply trust my brother the way I'd trusted him for 55 years of being related to him. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where this story stops. My mother explained that afternoon that Kevin had visited her 2 days earlier with a folder of paperwork, telling her it was a routine update to some of the trust's administrative documents, the kind of thing, he'd apparently told her, that needed periodic refreshing to stay current with changing regulations. Nothing significant, just a formality both trustees needed to sign to keep everything properly maintained. My mother, trusting her younger son the same way she trusted me, had agreed to have me come by to add my signature, understanding it as exactly the kind of unremarkable paperwork Kevin had described. I opened that folder at her kitchen table, expecting, honestly, exactly what my mother had described, some minor administrative update, a signature card refresh, perhaps an address change on an account. What I found instead was a document considerably more significant than anything resembling routine maintenance, and I want to describe the specific, sinking realization I felt reading through it the first time, sitting across from my mother, who was watching me with the patient, unworried expression of a woman who genuinely believed she was asking me to handle something entirely unremarkable. I remember the specific physical sensation of turning that first page. My mother's kitchen exactly as it had always been. The same faded yellow curtains she'd hung when I was in high school. The specific smell of her coffee still lingering from that morning. Everything ordinary and familiar, except for the document unfolding in my hands into something I was rapidly understanding, was anything but ordinary. The document was a proposed amendment to the Trust's Asset Management Authority, specifically requesting a home equity line of credit against my mother's house, the Trust's single largest asset, in the amount of $240,000, with the disbursement account listed not as any account associated with my mother's care or the trust itself, but as a business checking account belonging directly to Palmer Auto Group. I read that specific line 3 times before I fully absorbed what it actually meant. My brother was asking my mother, and by extension asking me as co-trustee, to leverage the equity in her own home, the house our father had spent 30 years paying off, to fund his car dealership. I want to describe the specific effort it took to keep my expression neutral, sitting across from my mother, understanding that whatever was actually happening here, alarming her before I had a clearer picture, wasn't going to help anyone, least of all her. I remember setting the document down carefully on the table, taking what I hoped looked like an ordinary sip of the coffee she'd poured me, giving myself a few seconds to steady my own reaction before continuing to read through the rest of the paperwork, which included, I noticed on that second, more careful pass, a specific timeline requesting the funds be disbursed within 14 days, a detail that struck me even in that first read as an unusual urgency for what Kevin had apparently described to my mother as routine administrative maintenance. I remember my mother watching me during that second read, her expression still carrying the same patient, unworried trust she'd had when she first slid the folder across the table, and I remember the specific, private ache of understanding, in that moment, exactly how completely she trusted both of her sons to be handling her affairs honestly. A trust I was about to have to navigate carefully, without either confirming her worst fears too abruptly or dismissing my own genuine concern simply to protect her from a difficult conversation before I had the full picture myself. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether Kevin had explained what the funds were actually for. She told me, without any hesitation, that Kevin had mentioned something about helping with some updates to my care situation, language vague enough that I understood immediately. She genuinely believed this money was somehow connected to her own well-being rather than her son's business finances. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I told my mother that afternoon that I wanted to take the document with me to review it properly before signing anything, explaining, gently, that trust documents of this size deserved careful attention regardless of who was asking. I watched a flicker of confusion cross her face, the specific, mild disorientation I'd come to recognize over the preceding 2 years, whenever a situation asked more of her cognitive processing than she could comfortably manage in the moment. And I told her, as reassuringly as I could, that everything was fine, that I simply wanted to be thorough. The same explanation I'd have given regardless of what I'd actually found in that folder. I did not call Kevin that evening. I want to be honest about that decision because I think it matters. I called Sandra Whitfield instead, my father's estate attorney, who had drafted the original trust document 6 years earlier and had, in the years since, become someone I genuinely trusted with exactly this kind of complicated family financial question. I remember that phone call vividly, sitting in my own home office at nearly 9 that night, unable to shake the specific unease I'd carried since leaving. Sandra answered on the second ring, and I remember the careful, measured way she listened to my description of the document without interrupting, asking only a handful of clarifying questions before telling me she wanted to review the actual paperwork herself before offering any real judgment. A specific professional caution I appreciated even as I wanted, in that moment, someone to simply tell me my instincts were either overblown or entirely justified. Sandra reviewed the document the following morning and called me back within a few hours, her voice carrying a specific, measured gravity that told me, before she'd said more than a few sentences, that my initial unease had been entirely warranted. She explained that the proposed home equity line of credit, as structured in the document, would have placed my mother's house at genuine, significant risk, given that a $240,000 line of credit against a home worth roughly $310,000 would have left almost no equity cushion if Palmer Auto Group, whatever its current financial situation actually was, proved unable to service the debt. I remember asking Sandra during that call whether there was any legitimate reading of the document I might be missing, some innocent explanation that would make Kevin's request less alarming than it appeared on its face. She told me she'd considered exactly that possibility herself, reviewing the document twice before calling me back specifically to make sure she wasn't overreacting to what might, in a different context, be an ordinary family business loan request. But the specific structure of the disbursement, routing directly to Palmer Auto Group's business account rather than through any intermediate step that would have given my mother or the trust genuine oversight of how the funds were actually used, combined with the unusually tight 14-day timeline, told her professionally that this wasn't structured the way a careful, transparent family financial arrangement typically would be. Sandra told me something else that morning that I want to describe carefully, because it's the detail that transformed this from a concerning but potentially explainable family financial request into something considerably more serious. She had, out of her own professional caution, made a quick call to the trust's designated financial institution to verify certain account details referenced in the document, and had learned in the process that Kevin had already, 3 weeks earlier, attempted to initiate a preliminary version of this same transaction using a limited power of attorney document, one that, as far as either Sandra or I could determine, my mother had signed without my knowledge or co-signature. An authority that the bank had ultimately declined to act on specifically because the trust's own governing documents required both trustees' signatures for any transaction of this size. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting in my own home office listening to Sandra explain this, understanding that Kevin had apparently already attempted once to move forward with this exact transaction without waiting for my signature at all, only to be stopped by the bank's own internal safeguards rather than by any hesitation on his part, and that the folder my mother had handed me across her kitchen table represented, essentially, a second attempt to accomplish through my cooperation what he'd already tried to accomplish without it. Sandra recommended, given the specific pattern she'd uncovered, that we conduct a broader review of the trust's financial activity over the preceding several months, rather than simply addressing this one document in isolation, a recommendation I agreed to immediately, understanding that whatever was actually happening with Kevin's business finances had likely been developing for longer than the 3 weeks since his first, unsuccessful attempt at this same transaction. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. That review, which took nearly 3 weeks to complete, working with both Sandra and a forensic accountant she recommended, revealed a considerably more complete and considerably more troubling picture than the single document I'd found at my mother's kitchen table. Palmer Auto Group, it turned out, had been in serious financial distress for nearly 2 years, a specific mounting crisis driven by a combination of factors: a poorly timed expansion into a second lot location that had never achieved the sales volume Kevin's business plan projected, rising floorplan financing costs that had squeezed his margins considerably tighter than his historical operating model could absorb, and, based on some of what the forensic account, a pattern of Kevin covering operating shortfalls with increasingly short-term, high-cost financing that had compounded into a debt load he had genuinely no clear path to servicing without a significant infusion of outside capital. I want to describe the specific forensic accountant Sandra recommended, a careful, methodical woman named Diane Cayo, who had spent nearly 20 years specializing in exactly this kind of complicated family business investigation, and who walked me through her findings over 3 separate meetings with a specific clarity that made an otherwise overwhelming financial picture considerably easier to actually absorb. I remember our first meeting in Diane's office, a modest, orderly space with the specific, understated professionalism of someone who has spent decades handling other families' financial crises with a discretion that never once tips into coldness. She spread the initial findings across her desk that afternoon, a series of carefully organized spreadsheets tracking Palmer Auto Group's financial deterioration month by month. And I remember the specific, sinking feeling of watching her point to the exact month, nearly 2 years earlier, when the second lot's losses had first begun consistently outpacing its revenue. A turning point Diane said Kevin himself had likely recognized at the time, but had apparently chosen to manage through increasingly desperate short-term borrowing rather than the harder, more immediate decision to scale back. I asked Diane, during that first meeting, whether she'd seen this specific pattern before in her 20 years of similar investigations, curious whether Kevin's situation was in any way unusual or whether it fit some more common, recognizable shape. She told me it was, unfortunately, one of the more common patterns she encountered. A proud business owner watching a specific initial mistake compound, quarter after quarter, rather than admitting the mistake early enough to correct course with considerably less damage. A specific, human tendency toward denial that she said she'd stop being surprised by even after 2 decades of watching it play out in family after family. Sandra joined us for the second half of that meeting, and I remember the specific, careful collaboration between the two of them. Sandra focused on the trust's legal exposure, and Diane focused on the underlying business realities, each asking the other pointed questions that helped build together a considerably fuller picture than either of them could have assembled working entirely alone. I want to describe how genuinely grateful I was, sitting in that office, for the specific professional thoroughness both women brought to what could have easily become an overwhelming, poorly understood crisis if I'd tried to navigate it without their combined expertise. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Diane showed me the specific timeline of Kevin's second lot expansion, opened 4 years ago with what had seemed, at the time, like a genuinely sound business case, projected sales volumes based on regional market data that had, in practice, never materialized, leaving Kevin carrying the fixed overhead costs of a second location that was, by the most recent numbers Diane could access, operating at a significant, sustained loss. She showed me, too, the specific escalating pattern of short-term financing Kevin had used to cover the resulting cash flow gaps, a series of increasingly expensive merchant cash advances and short-term business loans that had, over roughly 18 months, compounded into an effective interest burden considerably steeper than any of Kevin's original financing. The specific, familiar trap of a small business owner borrowing against tomorrow's revenue to cover today's shortfall. A pattern that becomes, Diane explained, exponentially harder to escape the longer it continues. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to describe the specific, complicated grief of learning all of this about my own brother, watching a forensic accountant lay out, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, a financial crisis Kevin had apparently been managing entirely alone for 2 years, never once mentioning it to me, our mother, or, as far as we could determine, anyone else in the family, right up until the moment his own resources were exhausted enough that our mother's home equity became the only remaining. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I confronted Kevin directly, 4 days after Sandra's forensic review was complete, driving to his dealership on a Saturday morning rather than calling, wanting this particular conversation to happen in person. I want to describe the drive itself, running through several different versions of how to open the conversation, understanding that whatever I said in the first 30 seconds was going to set the tone for everything that followed, and wanting, despite everything I'd learned, to approach my own brother with something closer to concern than accusation, however justified the accusation might have been. I found Kevin in his small office at the back of the dealership showroom, and I remember the specific look on his face when he saw me walk in unannounced on a Saturday. A flicker of surprise followed almost immediately by something that looked like resignation, as though some part of him had been expecting exactly this visit for longer than he wanted to admit. I sat down across from him and told him plainly that I knew about the failed power of attorney attempt, about the full scope of Palmer Auto Group's financial troubles, about everything Sandra and the forensic accountant had uncovered over the preceding 3 weeks. He didn't deny any of it, which I want to be honest surprised me, some part of me having braced for exactly the kind of defensive denial that would have made the entire conversation considerably harder. I watched him sit back in his chair, running both hands over his face in a specific gesture of exhaustion I hadn't seen from him since our father's funeral, and I remember the long silence that followed before he finally spoke. I didn't know what else to do, he told me, sitting in his own dealership office, the specific exhaustion in his voice telling me, even before he elaborated, exactly how long he'd been carrying this alone. I kept thinking I could turn it around before anyone had to know how bad it actually got. Mom's house was just sitting there with all that equity, and I told myself it was temporary, that I'd pay it back before it ever actually put her at risk. I know how that sounds now. I knew, honestly, how it sounded while I was doing it too. I just didn't have a better option I could see. I asked him why he hadn't come to me directly, months or even a year earlier, when the situation was presumably less dire than it had eventually become. He told me, with a specific rawness I hadn't expected, that he'd been genuinely afraid of exactly this reaction, of watching my face register the specific disappointment he assumed I'd feel learning that his business, the one Dad had helped him build, was failing under his own management. "You've always been the careful, the one who never took the kind of risk I took starting this place. I think some part of me couldn't stand the idea of proving you right about that, even if it meant making everything so much worse trying to avoid it. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think." I want to describe the specific, difficult work of the following months, because I think an honest telling of this story doesn't skip past how complicated the aftermath actually was. Kevin and I spent considerable time, alongside Sandra and a business bankruptcy attorney she recommended, working through Palmer Auto Group's actual financial situation, ultimately concluding that a structured Chapter 11 reorganization, rather than either a bailout funded by our mother's home equity or an outright liquidation, offered the most realistic path forward. One that let Kevin keep the dealership operating at a reduced scale while working through a court-supervised debt repayment plan with his actual creditors. I want to describe what those months of reorganization actually required of Kevin, because I think it matters for understanding how genuinely difficult the path forward turned out to be, even once we'd avoided the specific disaster of my mother's house being placed at risk. He was required to close the second lot location entirely, laying off 6 employees in the process. A specific, painful decision, he told me, was one of the hardest of his entire career, having personally hired most of those employees himself over the preceding 4 years. I remember Kevin describing that specific day to me, weeks later, the particular difficulty of sitting down individually with each of the 6 employees, several of whom had worked for him for over 3 years, explaining that their positions were being eliminated through no fault of their own. Watching their own specific shock and disappointment in a conversation he told me had been considerably harder than any single difficult customer interaction he'd navigated across 2 decades in the car business. He told me he'd written each of them a genuine letter of recommendation himself, staying late 3 separate nights to make sure each one was specific and personal rather than a generic template, a small gesture that struck me, hearing about it, as exactly the kind of decent, considered effort I hadn't fully expected from my brother during what was otherwise one of the worst professional stretches of his life. He told me about one employee in particular, a service technician named Ruddy who'd worked at the second lot since it opened, a specific conversation that Kevin said had stayed with him more than any of the others, Ruddy telling him, without any bitterness at all, that he understood exactly what kind of pressure Kevin had been under and that he hoped things worked out. Kevin told me he'd helped Ruddy find a position at a competitor dealership within 2 weeks, calling in a personal favor with an old industry contact, specifically to make sure Ruddy landed somewhere solid. A specific act of care that told me, hearing about it, how seriously Kevin was taking responsibility for the human cost of his own business decisions, even in the middle of his own considerable crisis. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. He submitted to a court-supervised reorganization plan that put him under considerably more financial oversight than he'd ever operated with before, monthly reporting requirements, and spending restrictions that Kevin, notably, never once complained about during the entire process, telling me, more than once, that he understood exactly why that level of oversight was now necessary. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. The bankruptcy attorney, a careful, experienced man named Frank Delacroix, who had handled dozens of small business reorganizations over his career, told Kevin something during their first meeting that Kevin later repeated to me, almost verbatim, because it had apparently struck him deeply. That a Chapter 11 reorganization wasn't a mark of failure so much as a structured, legally protected path back towards solvency, and that the businesses that came out the other side strongest were almost always the ones whose owners stopped trying to manage the crisis alone and let the actual process do the specific, careful work it was designed to do. I sat in on 2 of those early meetings with Frank myself, at Kevin's own request, a specific gesture of transparency that told me, more clearly than almost anything else he could have said, exactly how genuinely Kevin was committing to doing this differently than he'd managed the preceding 2 years alone. I remember Frank walking us both through the specific mechanics of the reorganization process, The automatic stay that would immediately halt his creditor's ability to pursue collection actions once the filing was complete, the structured timeline for submitting a repayment plan, the court-appointed trustee who would oversee the entire process to make sure it proceeded fairly for everyone involved. I remember Kevin taking careful notes throughout those meetings, a specific, deliberate diligence I hadn't seen from him in years, asking Frank pointed questions about exactly what oversight and reporting the process would require. Questions that told me he genuinely intended to hold himself to a considerably higher standard of transparency than the 2 years of quiet, solitary financial management that had brought him to this point in the first place. I want to describe the specific relief I felt, sitting in that office, watching a genuinely competent professional lay out a clear, legally protected path forward, considerably more reassuring than the vague, desperate improvisation Kevin had apparently been managing entirely alone for 2 years. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I did not tell my mother the full scope of what had happened, at least not immediately, understanding, with Sandra's careful guidance, that revealing the entire situation all at once risked causing her a level of distress and confusion that her current cognitive state made particularly difficult to process well. I told her instead a simplified, honest version that Kevin's business was going through serious financial difficulty, that I had decided, as co-trustee, not to sign the paperwork he'd brought her because it would have put her house at real risk, and that Kevin and I were working together with professional help to find him a better path forward that didn't involve her home at all. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe my mother's reaction to that simplified explanation because it surprised me in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. She was troubled, certainly, worried about Kevin in the specific, uncomplicated way a mother worries about any child in genuine trouble. But she was also, I noticed, quietly relieved, telling me, in a moment of clarity I've held onto since, that some part of her had sensed something wasn't quite right about that folder, even without being able to articulate exactly what, and that she'd been grateful, without ever quite finding the words to say so directly. That I'd taken the time to actually read it carefully, rather than simply trusting Kevin's brief explanation and signing on the spot. I remember her taking my hand across that same kitchen table, weeks later, during a follow-up conversation about how Kevin's reorganization was progressing, and telling me, with a specific, lucid steadiness that reminded me powerfully of the sharp, precise woman she'd been before her memory started slipping, that she was proud of me for reading twice what most people would have simply signed once. I don't think I've fully processed, even now, how much that particular sentence from her meant to me, given everything else happening in our family at the time. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button because this one isn't finished yet. Kevin and I have talked more in the month since that Saturday morning conversation in his dealership office than we had in probably the preceding 5 years combined. A specific, difficult but genuinely valuable byproduct of a crisis neither of us would have chosen, but that has, in its own complicated way, rebuilt a version of our relationship that had quietly atrophied over decades of comfortable, undemanding distance. I've learned things about Kevin's life during this stretch that I'm genuinely ashamed I didn't already know. The specific weight he'd carried since our father's death, believing, in some private, unexamined way, that he needed to prove himself capable of the same business success our father had modeled, a pressure that had, I think, made it considerably harder for him to admit when Palmer Auto Group struggles first began. Years before they ever reached the crisis point that led him to my mother's kitchen table, I remember a specific conversation, maybe 2 months into the reorganization process, when Kevin told me about a recurring dream he'd had throughout the worst months of the crisis. Standing in the original dealership lot our father had helped him build, watching it slowly sink into the ground beneath him while he tried, uselessly, to keep customers from noticing. He told me he'd never told anyone about that dream before, not even his wife, and I remember understanding, hearing him describe it, exactly how much private terror he'd been carrying entirely alone for 2 years. A specific isolation that our comfortable, undemanding sibling relationship had apparently done nothing to prevent, precisely because neither of us had ever built the habit of asking each other the genuinely hard questions. We've started having dinner together every other week now, just the two of us, a specific, deliberate habit neither of us had ever bothered to build during the previous 2 decades of holiday-only contact. And I want to describe what those dinners have actually looked like, because I think they represent something genuinely valuable that emerged from an otherwise painful crisis. We talk about the dealership's recovery, certainly, Kevin walking me through each month's reorganization progress with a transparency that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. But we've also started talking about considerably more ordinary things. Our own kids, our own marriages, the specific, quiet worries of middle-aged men that neither of us had ever felt comfortable voicing to the other before this crisis, forced a different kind of honesty between us. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to describe, too, the specific progress Palmer Auto Group has made under the reorganization plan, because I think it matters for understanding that this story, unlike some family financial crises, actually has a genuinely hopeful trajectory attached to it. 8 months into the court-supervised repayment plan, Kevin's remaining single-location dealership has returned to modest but genuine profitability, considerably smaller in scale than the two-location operation he'd once envisioned, but stable in a way it hadn't been in over 2 years. He's ahead of schedule on his creditor repayment plan, a fact he told me about with a specific, quiet pride that reminded me powerfully of the young man who'd first opened that original lot at 33, before 2 decades of accumulated pressure, and eventually, crisis had worn some of that confidence away. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming. I didn't know, sitting in my mother's kitchen that Thursday afternoon reading a document I'd expected to be routine, that the specific choice to read it twice rather than simply trusting my brother's brief explanation was going to unravel 2 years of a financial crisis Kevin had been carrying entirely alone, or that the forensic review Sandra recommended was going to surface a second, considerably smaller irregularity in the trust's records from nearly 4 years earlier. An unexplained transfer that none of us, including Sandra, had immediately clear answers for. One that was going to require its own separate, careful investigation in the months ahead. I want to describe that second irregularity briefly, because it's going to matter considerably more than any of us initially expected. Diane Keogh's forensic review, working methodically backward through nearly 6 years of trust financial records, flagged a specific $12,000 transfer from 4 years earlier, made shortly after our father's death, to an account none of us could immediately identify. A transaction that predated Kevin's current financial troubles by nearly 2 years and that, Diane told us carefully, didn't fit the pattern of anything else she'd found in her review of Kevin's more recent act. Kevin, when I asked him about it directly, told me he had no memory of authorizing any such transfer, a response that, given everything else I'd learned about him over the preceding months, I found myself genuinely inclined to believe, which meant the question of who had actually authorized that transfer, and why, was going to require considerably more digging than either of us had anticipated needing to do. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, several months removed from that Thursday afternoon in my mother's kitchen, is that the specific habit of reading something twice, of pausing before signing simply because someone you trust has asked you to, is not the same thing as distrust. It is, I've come to understand, one of the most genuine forms of care available to anyone entrusted with protecting someone more vulnerable than themselves. My mother asked me to sign a piece of paper because her son told her it was routine, and I very nearly did exactly that, out of nothing more complicated than the ordinary, decent instinct to trust my own brother. I think often about how differently this story might have unfolded if I'd simply signed that document at my mother's kitchen table the way she'd expected me to, trusting Kevin's brief, vague explanation the same way she had. I think about the specific, considerable damage that would have followed. My mother's home equity drained to fund a business already too far gone to save with that infusion alone. A foreclosure risk hanging over the house our father spent 30 years paying off. And a family crisis considerably harder to recover from than the one we actually navigated, precisely because the resources to help Kevin properly, through the reorganization process, rather than a doomed bailout, would have already been gone. I think, too, about the specific weight my father placed on the dual trustee structure all those years ago, sitting both Kevin and me down to explain why he wanted 2 sets of eyes on decisions this significant. And I understand, now, with a clarity I don't think I fully had before this entire situation unfolded, exactly how right he was to insist on it. I don't think my father anticipated this specific crisis, watching one son bring paperwork to endanger the other's inheritance, however unintentionally. I think he simply understood, from his own long life running a business and raising 2 very different sons, that even the people we trust most completely can, under enough pressure, make decisions that require a second, careful pair of eyes to catch before they cause genuine harm. The $240,000 I didn't sign away that afternoon is still sitting, protected, in the equity of the house my father spent 30 years paying off, and Kevin is still working, one careful month at a time, through a debt he no longer has to carry entirely alone. My mother still lives in that same house, still makes coffee in the same kitchen where I once sat reading a document that could have cost her everything. And Kevin and I talk now, every other week, in a way we never managed to build across the 2 decades before this crisis forced the issue. I've thought more than once since about what my father would make of everything that happened, watching one son bring paperwork to unknowingly endanger the other's inheritance and their mother's home, and watching, too, the specific, hard-won repair that eventually followed. I think he would recognize, in the reorganization Kevin has committed to, and in the considerably more honest relationship Kevin and I have built since, exactly the kind of resilience he always believed both his sons were capable of, even in the moments when neither of us fully believed it ourselves. I visit my mother most Thursdays still, the same routine that carried me into her kitchen that fateful afternoon, and I find these days that our conversations carry a specific ease they hadn't quite had before, both of us, I think, quietly grateful that a difficult chapter resolved itself the way it did. I think about how close I came to simply signing that folder without a second look, and I am considerably more grateful than I expected to be for the specific, unremarkable habit of reading things twice. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Thanks for being here. For real.